G'day, I'm Andrew Fenwick, and welcome to A Weed to Know.
Info on a weed to know basis. Weed to know. Interviews and news, cannabis info on a weed to know basis. Weed to know. Weed to know.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of A Weed to Know. Very interesting one today. It's one of those issues that is primary in all the governments around Australia and probably the world when they start discussing legalising cannabis for adult choice and use. Every time I've spoken to a politician in my world, they seem to be in favour of legalising cannabis, but they always come up against this little backstop where they go, yeah, but what do we do about road safety? People driving impaired. How can we tell when someone's impaired by cannabis? Oh, well, we can't do anything. We just can't move forward. Now, if Australia or New South Wales, the state we're in, were the first to be considering this, I can understand the hesitation and wanting to get all the details on how this might work. But when we look into the world, we've got 15 years of international experience that sort of proves that the sky doesn't fall in when we legalise cannabis. And some of the results from it are actually quite surprising. In Australia, this week, this month, has been a fairly significant month for this. The legalised cannabis people in Victoria, Rachel Payne and David Eddershank, have done a great job of pushing the Victorian state government towards having some sort of, initially a medical defence for having THC at a roadside drug test, which the previous Victorian government said they'd move in and they'd get this fixed. But with the new Premier, still the same party, new Premier in the same party, it all slowed down very much. And it went from being, yes, we're going to address this medical defence issue, to being, well, we will sooner or later. And then they announced that they'd spend almost $5 million on an 18-month trial on closed roads to gather data before making a decision on this. So everyone was pretty disappointed with that in terms of timing-wise. This didn't help all those people that were legally using a prescription cannabis product and having to choose between freedom, transport or health. So either they stopped using the cannabis and went on to harder, maybe potentially side effect filled pharmaceuticals, or they run the gauntlet and drove anyway, and then end up in the legal justice system because they're using a prescribed medicine. So nobody's really happy with that situation. And I think, like a lot of people, I thought, well, we're just going to have to wait 18 months before there's a decision on this. Well, Rachel and David have done a great job and have actually got an amendment through the Victorian Parliament, which now doesn't change things too much, but it's gone from being a mandatory requirement of licence suspension for the presence of THC to now giving the courts discretion over this, and that it's not mandatory now for people to lose their licence, which means that you have a prescription, you get found with THC. If it does go to court, at least there's a situation where the judge can go, well, you're using your medicine as prescribed. The police haven't shown that there was any evidence of impairment. It's just that you came up positive on a test, and hopefully that'll at least open the door for the next 18 months being a little bit better, or maybe 2 years by the time that road trial results have come in, to have a better time of it. But yes, congratulations for Rachel and David. They have done a fabulous job. Now back to this 15 years of international experience. What's happened in the world? What are other people doing? So if you look at, there's a few ways of looking at this. One is you just allow a certain amount of THC to be allowed in the blood or in the saliva at a roadside test, and that will deem you either possibly impaired or not impaired, and off you go. This varies around the world, like as it is in Australia. That's 0. You have no no tolerance for THC. Once you have a positive test, you are into the system and you have to fight your way out of it. Across Europe, it varies between 0 and 2 nanograms per mil. In the States, it varies between 2 and 5 nanograms per mil. In Germany, the most recent big country to make the decision to not fully legalise, but they've pretty much legalised recreational cannabis over there, they decided, and it surprised everyone because it just came out of the blue, that they would set a 3.5 nanogram per mil limit for THC. If you're over 3.5, we'll consider you have some impairment, and if you're below, you're right to move on. So I like the Colorado version, which is a inferred limit of 5 nanogram per mil. And it's not that 5 nanograms is a line in the sand like, say, Germany is, where over you're under the influence and impaired, under you're good to go. This is more at 5 and over. There is an assumption or a permission almost to the courts that they can assume that you might have been impaired at the time of your offence. But it's also up to the law to prove that you were in fact impaired or that you showed signs of impairment. One of the upsides of this is that the Colorado State Police are also trained in detecting drug impairment. So they're drug impairment driving experts, or I can't remember, they have a title like that. So I like that because at least there's some flexibility, and it comes back to the only reason we're worried about THC impairment on the roads is because we don't want anyone driving stoned. We don't want road safety to be affected by legalisation of cannabis. A lot of this may come down to how you educate your drivers, but I mean, we've been educating drivers about drink driving for years, and one of the leading causes of fatal crashes is obviously the inclusion of alcohol. So why aren't everyone adopting these per se limits and say 5 nanograms per mil? Well, the main reason is because unlike alcohol, it's not linear. We can't show that there's a certain level of impairment for the amount of THC that you get in your test. And one of those trials which our next guest was involved in was pretty much examining the effectiveness of these per se THC limits to detect impairment. And you can look at this study in 2 ways. One of them is, well, it doesn't really work at all, but there's probably some detail that come out of it that we can say, well, at least a per se limit of 3.5 or 5 shows that the likelihood of the person having had cannabis recently, like just in a few hours before they drove, is unlikely, because after just a few hours that detectable THC limit does drop quite a bit. So we can use this. I think it's just about being a little bit, kind in how we use it, rather than just a brick wall that either you're on one side of it or you're on the other. But yeah, the study that Thomas was involved in pretty much showed that people who were over the per se limits, half of them were impaired and half of them weren't. And then when they, sort of 3.5 hours later, when they tested again, half of them were impaired and half of them weren't. So it's a very interesting thing, and maybe some people in the simulated test were just bad drivers or bad at the simulation. I don't know how you tease that out of a study, but they're testing for well-known criteria. The standard lateral position, so that's basically how much you're swerving on the road and how much you're correcting and how much time it takes to do that, and how you maintain distance and speed between you and the vehicle in front. These are all things that, it's all about your perspective and reaction time and how you're feeling. But I was actually surprised when I looked into this, just how little deviation is picked up to show that you're impaired. So if we just take an example that, like one of the examples there, like their placebo result was that the person was moving 19 centimetres in the lane to that was the standard movement in the lane was 19 centimetres. Well, impairment is like if you're 2 more centimetres, you're considered that you're impaired compared to your placebo or baseline. So if we have a look at that, part of the information that was shared in the study was that with a alcohol reading at 0.02, your deviation increases by 1.2 centimetres. So even at 0.2, it changes. People are becoming impaired at 0.2, and at 0.5, it's 2.4 centimetres. Once again, that doesn't sound too much, but if this is a standard way of measuring road impairment, driving impairment, that shows that 0.5, the governments of Australia have decided that to allow people to use alcohol, they're allowed to be 0.5 impaired. So if we compare that to the trials that were done in the Netherlands, which is another interesting trial, we'll talk about that in a second, where they actually put people out on the road with an instructor beside them in a censored car in traffic and measured them having used standardised amounts of cannabis that they'd use normal for their own medication. With a THC dominant medication, their deviation was 2.33 centimetres, which is actually slightly less than 0.5 in the alcohol impairment. And the other thing that we've heard myths about using CBD will reduce the amount of impairment. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case either. So I think there's a lot of education needs to go around this in terms of driving. When they tested a 1-to-1 where it was equal amounts of THC and CBD in the product, the impairment was actually 2.8. So it was a little bit higher up than the 0.5 and the THC dominant. So it only took 3.5 hours for that impairment to pretty much go away. So the same people tested in the same conditions, they went from having a deviation of plus 2.3, plus 2.8, to having a deviation of minus half a centimetre and 1.2 centimetres. So after 3 hours, the 1-to-1 was about the same as an 0.2, and after the 3 hours, the THC dominant was actually better than what they were when they started out. So we can tell that, like alcohol, if somebody's using acute use, like they've just gone out and had a party and they've used some cannabis, that after a few hours, their impairment drops off dramatically. So the presence of the THC, which is the other thing, you get all these false positives where people are shown to exceed the limit of detection of the devices, but they have no impairment. And this is probably the main complaint for everyone on the medicinal cannabis medical defence for THC presence, is that if you're using your medicine as directed, and most likely in the evening before, the next day you're not going to be impaired. And like all the other drugs, there's just a warning on the label that says, please don't operate vehicles and heavy machinery after use. We trust people to do that with all these other medications that are on the marketplace that we don't necessarily test for on the roadside under their own regulation. We trust you to use your medications directed and to drive safely. So there's going to be a lot of education required in this, but it still doesn't excuse our governments using this as an excuse for not moving forward with the legalisation of cannabis, the regulation of cannabis, taking all this income out of the hands of criminals, allowing people to grow their own, making some tax revenue. just doesn't make sense that our governments are so hesitant to move forward on this. So how is cannabis affecting drivers in the real world? I found this exercise really interesting because we have all this data. People have been doing this for a long time. People know the road statistics, medical statistics, they're all kept. We all know that, we get reported on every school holiday how many crashes there have been, how many fatalities there have been. We know that all this data is collected and can be correlated. So what happened? Well, one study I looked at found that 20 to 30% of crashes, including cannabis, occurred because of the drug use. However, it also noted that 85% of alcohol-involved crashes were caused by the alcohol. So there's a big difference there, that people using alcohol are more likely to crash than people who are using cannabis. The other one was that cannabis appearing to increase crash risk by 2 to 3 times compared to 6 to 15 times for alcohol. And one French study estimated that 2.5% of fatal crashes involve cannabis compared to 29% of crashes involving alcohol. So we can see that there's definitely a balance where, yes, people are still having accidents because they're impaired by cannabis. The rates aren't the equivalent to the alcohol. It was also interesting that in some places in the States and in Europe, since there's been legalisation, that the occurrences of positive tests at the roadside has almost doubled. So there's double the amount of THC being detected, but there isn't the double amount of road accidents and there isn't the double amount of fatalities. So that's interesting as well. Another one where they were comparing the effect of THC and alcohol and the combination of both, found that alcohol, you were 16.3 times the risk of having a fatal accident. Cannabis was 1.5 times more likely to have a fatal accident, but you combine cannabis and alcohol together and it's 25 times more likely that you'll have a fatal accident. This is one of those education points that we need to really push home, even for people on their medical cannabis, is that we cannot use cannabis with alcohol and drive. It makes both of them worse and makes the road a very unsafe place. So don't do it. So you think with all this new cannabis coming into America, we've got, at this point of this study, I think there was 19 states in America that had legalised adult use cannabis. So we've already seen that the amount of cannabis showing up on the roads is sort of doubling. We know that it's coming up. People are involved in accidents because they're using cannabis. It's not as big a cause, but it's there. So what was done was a study where they looked at all the first full years of legalisation in each of the states in America where they had legalised. And I suppose when you go into a study like that, you're probably going to think, oh no, what are we going to find? This is going to be, the sky's falling in on road safety. But in fact, there was a net reduction of between 8 and 11% in fatal road accidents in each of those states. That doesn't mean that driving with cannabis impaired is good or safe, but what they're saying is that it's like a substitution. They're expecting that it's a substitution issue where people are now, that cannabis is legal and cheaper, that they're using cannabis instead of alcohol. And if we look at all those other stats about the risks of accidents and road fatalities involving alcohol versus THC, that instead of being at 16 times the risk of having a fatal accident, you're down to 1.5 times the risk of having a fatal accident. And as a result of the 20%, 30% of drivers using cannabis instead of alcohol, we've had this reduction in road fatalities. At no point is anyone assuming that driving with cannabis impairment is a good thing and it's safe. But what is showing up is that statement at the beginning that when you legalise cannabis, that the net result isn't massive road trauma, and it isn't the sky falling in, and it isn't all this stuff that the stigmatised politicians will keep trotting out to try and keep supporting this moral-based law of, well, you can't have cannabis because it's an evil drug, but you can keep consuming alcohol because, well, it's acceptable, it's socially acceptable that we have alcohol. In fact, we turn 18, we celebrate it in Australia, and everyone gets drunk. Turn 21, you get drunk again. You get married, drunk, you have anniversaries, we go out and drink. We go to football games, we drink. It's just a very interesting situation where we have a society that fully embraces alcohol, which is a deadly poison, isn't safe at any dose, tears through the DNA in your cells like a knife, is implicated in a great long list of diseases, chronic and acute, and is rated as the highest damaging drug that is in society, to both the user and society. So that being the case, just to make sure that we can do it, we allow people to drive on the road with an acceptable level of impairment. But if you're using cannabis, there is no acceptable level of impairment, even though you're statistically less likely to have a crash. So our next guest is Dr Thomas Arkell from Swinbourne University. Thomas has been involved directly in 4 different studies evaluating the effect of cannabis on driving impairment and the testing of, including the 2 of the studies that I just mentioned then, the Netherlands on-road study and the simulated study in Sydney. He's a very intelligent young fellow. I first came across him at Nimbin at the Mardi Gras. He did a presentation covering off these studies, and I just found it absolutely amazing, the amount of data they collected. So what we're going to talk about is a little bit about the studies he's already done, but more importantly, Thomas is involved in the new road trial in Victoria, and he goes into quite a bit of depth and detail about how that study is run and what they're collecting. And I think, as much as I think the Victorian government could have moved forward with a medical defence for THC instantly, they could have just made a decision to do that. Regardless of what happens on that front, this study that they're doing in Victoria is the first one in the world where this much effort has been put into determining the effects of THC impairment on driving. So the bottom line is that we've got a little bit of a groundbreaker here that should provide data that hopefully will not just inform the governments of Australia but the governments of the world to make some sensible choices around THC driving and the testing of people who use cannabis. So enjoy the rest of the show with Tom, and we'll catch you next time.
Weed to know, cannabis info on a weed to know basis.
Hi, I'd just like to welcome Dr Thomas Arkell to A Weed to Know. How are you, Thomas?
Good, thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for making the time. It's a very big topic at the moment for lots of people in the community and in the industry to cover this whole driving THC impairment issue and try and draw a line under it and get some good policies happening, I suppose. So, as I mentioned when we were chatting on the phone, I first came across you at Nimbin at the Mardi Gras. You were doing a presentation there, and you presented the results of 2 or 3 studies, and it was very interesting.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, a couple of years ago now.
Yeah.
I haven't been back since, actually, but I would like to go back up again. It's quite a fun event.
It's a nice weekend. It is worthwhile for anyone who's even remotely interested in the whole cannabis industry and where it's going. Lots of good talks, but it's also just a very entertaining, fun weekend. I thoroughly enjoy going myself. So how many studies have you actually been involved in, Tom?
How many studies?
Yeah.
Let's see. So in terms of, like clinical trials where we're giving people cannabis or getting people to consume whatever they've been prescribed by their doctor, and then, either getting them in the driving sim or to do a bunch of cognitive testing. Probably four or five now, I would say. And then I have a few other little studies that are ongoing at the moment. I've got one project for the ACT government that's looking at whether cannabis decriminalisation has any impact on road safety. Another little study with alcohol where we're sort of piloting a new driving simulator scenario and trying to establish its sensitivity to alcohol effects.
Okay.
And then in our lab now we have a whole range of other studies going on that I'm not directly involved with, but studies looking at a range of different drugs, some stimulants. There's been some work with methamphetamine, quite a bit with alcohol, some benzodiazepines. So yeah, quite a range of things. But in terms of my cannabis and driving stuff, a couple of I suppose key ones.
Yeah, I was really taken by the Netherlands one, where it was like, you're taking it into live traffic. It's not simulated. You're taking it into a live traffic situation. What was your biggest takeaway from that?
My biggest takeaway was that the Netherlands is a very pragmatic country. No, I mean, I actually have quite a few takeaways from it, but it's interesting because it's the only place in the world where you can really do that kind of work. We're about to start on something which I'm sure we'll touch on. That's similar in a way, but not quite in traffic. So the Netherlands is really the only place where you can do this kind of on-road studies, in a very real-world naturalistic environment with other people driving on the highway. And they've been doing this for over 30 years, and they've really led the way in this. And so that study was, the first time that anyone's really given people standardized doses of inhaled cannabis with different amounts of THC and CBD, and seeing what happens when people are actually driving in the real world. And the findings were interesting. Overall we saw some driving impairment, within the first hour or 2 hours, and that really tapered off by around 4 hours. The level of impairment we saw in that that first drive, so this was 40 to 100 minutes, so roughly an hour to an hour and a half after people had gone ahead and vaporized one of those few different kinds of cannabis. We see, a change in driving performance that's pretty similar to what you would see in a driver with a BAC of 0.05.
Okay.
So not huge, but also not negligible.
Yeah. And I mean, we did sort of touch on this on the phone the other day. I mean, even the arbitrary 0.05 number, it sort of is a government license to be a little bit impaired. Like we're accepting that you can be this much impaired, and we're okay with that. It's a very interesting. Yeah. It's a very interesting grandfathering clause we have for alcohol consumption, that even from a road safety point of view, we'll just let you be a little bit impaired, and that's okay.
It's a funny one, isn't it? We make a lot of concessions for alcohol in a lot of different, walks of life, but this is certainly one of them. And I mean, the US, it's still 0.08 across most of the country.
Yeah, and I know plenty of people that you wouldn't want to be in the car at 0.08. Some people aren't fit for driving at 0.08 at all.
No, absolutely not. And there's been a bit of a push there to reduce that to 0.05, but it's sort of a fairly soft voice, I would say, that's really pushing for that. So it may stay as 0.08 for the time being, but that's quite a lot of alcohol to have in your system. I mean, we know that your crash risk really does go up a lot at 0.08. It does go up at 0.05 too.
Yeah.
Some people are fine at 0.5, other people are not fine. As you said to me on the phone, I think you said your wife wouldn't, would never get in the car at 0.05.
No. I mean, she has a couple of glasses of wine in a whole night, and she knows she doesn't want to drive a car. So it's very interesting that from a cannabis point of view, we're okay to have an arbitrary number for alcohol, but we're not so keen on an arbitrary number for THC levels. As you said, we have all these interesting concessions for alcohol that you just wouldn't accept for any other intoxicating substance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because it's legal. I think with cannabis, the way that the laws are set up now really do reflect the fact that, for the longest time, it was an illegal substance. And now that we have medical here, the road safety stuff just hasn't quite caught up. It's a bit of a hangover from the past in a way, that still the way we're dealing with cannabis is very much as an illicit substance. And that has changed a bit since 2015, 2016, when medical started to take off here, and when doctors could start prescribing. So we haven't caught up to that. I think we're still, in many ways, treating cannabis just as an illicit substance.
It's a very for a progressive country, we just seem to be so conservative when it comes to some things, and this is one of them. We've got all this. We've got about 15 years worth of international data to lean on now, to tell us exactly how legalisation will affect road safety and crime and domestic violence and society and youth. We've got all that information. It's already sitting out there, and yet we won't lean into that at all. We have to do it all ourselves again, which is very interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if it is a very progressive country. I think people look at our way of life and I think that part of it looks progressive. But from a politics point of view, I mean, Australia always seems to me to be extremely conservative and risk-averse when it comes to, I suppose, changing the status quo or changing, legislation that's been there for a long time.
Absolutely.
It tends to be, let's sort of not rock the boat, let's not really do anything in case X, Y, and Z could go wrong. We're sort of very risk-averse, I think, when it comes to things like this. And then often there's very knee-jerk reactions. I mean, the recent vaping reform is probably a good example of that, where it suddenly took off and they said, we're just going to ban this and introduce this pharmacy model, but pharmacists said, we don't want anything to do with that, we're not going to do that. And so you sort of can't just change overnight and say, it's different now, guys, we're not doing that thing anymore. It doesn't work like that.
But didn't even ask them, you're going to do this now. And the other thing that was harmed with that is quite obviously the people who use vaporizers to access their medical cannabis now don't have a supply of vapes because they can't get the machines because they're all caught up in this ban. As you said, the knee-jerk stuff. And then we have in New South Wales, our Premier just announced this big, it was almost a celebratory announcement that he's going to allow full-strength beer back in the football stadiums. And so is this really an issue that, do we need people to be drunker at the football? Apparently so. And it was all about rights. You shouldn't lose your right to drink full-strength beer. I'm thinking, this is and our Premier in 2019 was very enthusiastic about the idea of cannabis legalisation. The moment he gets into power, it's like it was never said, and now he's against it, and he's kicking the ball down the road with a really flimsy drug summit. And as you said, this the will to change the status quo seems to be very, very reluctant at all to do, and it's right across the country. But we seem to go backwards really easily. You look at some of the regressions, like the Labor Party in Western Australia actually had it in their policy platform to decriminalise cannabis and make it available, and they actually stepped back from that. The same party with a new leader stepped back from a policy they already had. So you're right. We might have a facade of progressiveness, but it doesn't get very deep when it comes to politics.
No, I don't think so.
And this sort of leans into the next thing I wanted to ask you about is that when Dan Andrews was the Premier of Victoria, he made this pretty big promise that he would address the issue of medical cannabis users getting access to road and having a system of at least a medical defence for driving with THC. Everyone got really excited about that, and then we had a change of Premier, and all of a sudden we're looking at it now. Now we're going to do this 18-month trial, and we're going to throw $5 million at it. And it seems, I don't know, like the initial response in Victoria was just kicking it down the road again. But as we mentioned the other day, this is a world first. Nobody's ever done this before from a government point of view. So how's it working? What's the structure of it, and what are we measuring, and how's it coming together?
It's a huge undertaking. I think at first people, at least I heard some people saying 18 months, why is this taking so long? It should have already sort of been done. But I don't think people realise the amount of time and effort and the logistical complexity that goes into running something like this. Yeah. 18 months is actually not very long to get everything in place to run a study that's never been done before. Legislation had to be changed in Victoria to allow the study to happen in the first place,
Really?
to give drivers an exemption from the Road Safety Act for the purposes of the trial.
Even on a closed circuit?
Even on a closed circuit, it's still illegal to have any amount of THC in your system. So that had to be amended for this. And then you've got, for example, we've now got two specially instrumented research vehicles that have just come up from Canberra recently. But those have to be kitted out with all kinds of engineering tech. So we've got these two very, very sort of cool and quite advanced research vehicles that allow us to monitor almost everything that you can possibly think of when it comes to driving. So these are cars with a range of different cameras pointing in different directions to look at things like, you may have heard of this standard deviation of lateral position measure that comes up in our Netherlands study, the weaving thing. And so this is very often used in driving research because it's a very sensitive measure of alcohol and other drug effects. So now we have cameras sort of mounted on the roof vehicle that are looking down, and then we have to develop our own little bit of software to be able to calculate exactly the distance between the car and that lane marking and see how much that varies over time. But so we're getting all the information that we can out of the car itself, so things like the steering wheel position, the wheel position, light states, is the back right door open, like everything that the car would normally be collecting, we can essentially suck that out, and we end up with a huge file, with thousands and thousands of variables. And then we have information on the driver's blink rate, where they're looking on the road. We can start to really tap into fixation points and their gaze dispersion, see how much randomness there is in people's visual search patterns. So this is something you often see with alcohol, particularly with sedative drugs, that people's search patterns become a bit more erratic. You can imagine if you're looking at a sort of central point on a screen and then or on the road, and then you have to look 5 meters to the right. People might often overshoot that
and look further
if they're under the influence of the
Okay.
and so you get this sort of slight randomness
Cool.
and less, I suppose, precision in people's gaze dispersion. So that's another thing that we're looking at. Then we're monitoring, speed and harsh braking events and all kinds of things. So there's going to be a ton of data that comes out of this.
And are they following other vehicles as well to maintain gaps? Is that part of it?
No, so there's limitations in. We can't do everything that we, I suppose, might want to do in an ideal world. The tracks that we have access to are they're very well set up for, I suppose, collecting. So maybe a bit more background. So we've got two tracks that we're going to be using for this trial. One is more of a driver training facility where we can look at essentially, basic driving skills and tight cornering. There'll be a driving instructor there in the car the whole time, so they get some impression of whether that person, would be fit to drive. And these are people that have been, training drivers for 30, 40 years. They have a very good sense of, what a safe driver looks like. And then the other place is a highway track where we can look at people driving at, up to 100 kilometers an hour.
Okay.
And really monitor exactly what highway driving would normally look like. In terms of having a vehicle in front, as we've done before in the simulator, it's tricky to do that for safety and operational reasons, to have two cars on the tracks with someone following. But it's also quite a hard thing to operationalize. It's a little different when you're on a highway and that just happens. You're always behind another vehicle, and so you can always monitor someone's sort of average distance between them and the car ahead. That's something we would, I suppose, be interested in doing in the future, but not for this. This is more just driving around. It's a 4.5 kilometer highway circuit. It follows the natural undulation of the land. It's in a big sort of swathe of bush, in southwest Victoria, a couple of hours out of Melbourne. So it's as good as we can possibly get to a real world highway scenario without being on the road itself.
Yeah, especially at speed, being able to manage lane position and cornering, all that sort of stuff. Yeah. But in your simulations, you have been monitoring that, maintaining distance and speed.
Yeah, exactly. But when it's in the simulator, what we do is we program that lead vehicle. We tell it to sort of change its speed in a sinusoidal manner. So it's going up and down, say 10 or 20% at random intervals, and we'll say, after 6.5 seconds, increase speed by 2.5 kilometers an hour, and so forth. So it's very scripted into the program to make that car behave in a very particular way, which is obviously a lot more difficult to do. You've got to have someone driving in the real world. So it's harder to get someone to do exactly that same thing after, say, 6 seconds, decrease your speed by 2.5 kilometers an hour.
And especially when you're comparing people, so you want the data set to be the same, so you can compare the reactions.
It's impossible to make that perfectly consistent the way that we can in the simulator. And that's one of the good things about the simulator, but there's advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah. Now, it sounds really interesting. And I also noticed in the study there, it was about managing distractions and things. Are they actually going to use other interactions to see how people react?
Yeah, we have some novel distraction tasks that we're introducing. So we can look at, it's really about workload. Once you increase someone's the cognitive load and the workload while they're driving, what effect does that have on their driving performance and their visual scanning behaviours? So that's another thing that we're, I suppose, modulating throughout the trial is level of cognitive load and seeing how that might be affected. So we have, we're going to have 72 patients involved in this, a mixture of people with chronic pain, mental health condition and sleep disorders, half using inhaled oral products. And it's essentially a whole week of testing. So people have to come down, stay 2 nights in accommodation near one of the tracks, a full day of testing there, back to Melbourne, and then taken to this other track later in the week. So it's a very intensive protocol. It really does take up almost a whole week of someone's time. And then we're also running a sub-study with alcohol. So this will be a small clinical trial on the side, using exactly the same drive. So we really replicate all of the procedures that we're doing with patients. But instead of patients using medical cannabis, we just swap in alcohol and healthy volunteers. So that gives us a nice, I suppose, point of comparison and say, we know now what sort of changes, if any, we're seeing in patients in this kind of driving environment. How does that compare to someone who's at that borderline 0.05 BAC level?
And that's great because from a policymaker point of view, if we can let the politicians know that we're operating in the same realm in terms of, we're accepting this level of impairment for alcohol and the cannabis actually turns out to be a bit less or much the same, it must be easier for them to go, we understand this now, we're more okay with it.
Yeah, I mean that'll be a decision for the government to make when all the data comes in. I mean, we have no idea what the results of this are going to look like. We go into this blind and we try and design the best possible study we can. But no one has done this before.
No.
We've done a bit of work with patients in our lab with a simulator study. Patients in a similar way self-administering a standard dose of their own medical cannabis. But that was the first time anyone had done that in a simulator. And this is certainly the first time anyone's done this kind of on-road study with actual medical cannabis patients. And Australia is quite unique for this. There's been, I suppose, a little bit of work to this effect in Canada, but it's very different because patients don't, go and get a prescription for, say, a vape cartridge with 700 milligrams of THC, and they're told to inhale for 3 to 4 seconds. It's not like that. You can go into a dispensary and buy whatever you want. So we're actually very uniquely positioned in Australia because we're really one of the few places that has a medical market that is that regulated, where you go and get a prescription for a very particular product.
And for you've got the data that says this is how much they've been prescribed and how they've used it, and know that that's going to be at least reasonably standardised. It won't be great, but it's better than, as you said, going into a retail outlet and buying what you want.
Exactly. I mean, it's as good as we can possibly get. The other way to approach this would be to run, a clinical trial where you bring patients in and you either give them placebo or a standardized dose of THC. But the problem with that then is, does that dose sort of have any resemblance to what that person actually uses?
Yeah, in real life.
And if the answer is no, the data is, more or less useless. You can give someone 15 mgs of THC in an edible, but if they normally only inhale 1 milligram of THC at a time, that doesn't really reflect their real world use. So we're trying to strike a balance between, having a rigorous study design, but also making this as ecologically valid as possible. And that means that you have patients who are coming in and using whatever they would normally use.
Yeah, awesome.
How
long is it going to take to get through the 72 patients to get them to both circuits and collect all that data?
Well, we've got 18 months ahead of us of data collection, so we're going to be working hard, and we have a pretty intensive testing schedule over the next 18 months to get all that together.
Okay, yeah. Certainly, as you said, I didn't realise there were going to be 72, because that's actually quite a big number to do something like this. But it gives you a really nice sample from a.
It does. But that's 72 with a week of testing each, plus 24 participants doing the alcohol study with 4 sessions each. So that's a lot of days of data collection.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, certainly got your work cut out for you to get all that through.
Yeah.
And as you said, you've got no idea what to expect from this, because nobody's ever done it before to this level of detail. So it should be very interesting. So I was just thinking about the logistics of it in terms of all the weather conditions you're going to have to deal with, and just the fact that some people aren't great drivers. I mean, that's also going to have to. Do you do a starting standard point for the person without any THC to see what sort of driver they are to compare to?
Yeah, we do. So on the testing days, that people will be doing 3 drives. They do one in the morning, and that's before they've used their medical cannabis, and then 2 afterwards at 2 different time points.
Okay.
So we try and get that period when, if people were to be impaired, what would that time period theoretically look like? And so that's that first time point. And then the second one is a few hours later, when we expect that people would generally be more or less back to baseline if there was any impairment. So
you're doing
and we're never comparing people to other people, always comparing people to their own baseline.
To themselves, yeah. So their baseline, are you checking to see that they actually are free of THC on the day? Are they having?
We're not going to make sure it's THC, because it's unrealistic. I mean, anyone that's using cannabis on a daily basis for medical reasons is going to have THC in their system.
I was just checking that. Yeah.
So we can't make sure they're THC free, but all we can do is say, avoid using a medical cannabis after X time, say the night before.
Yeah. To give you that 12-hour window or whatever.
Well, I mean, most people do use it in the evening, right? If particularly if you've got a sleep disorder, that's exactly when you're using cannabis. So we're not going to interfere with that, because then you have, maybe this other problem where if someone hasn't used cannabis the night before, and they always do, perhaps they've slept terribly, perhaps their pain's flared up overnight, and in that case their baseline's going to be... Yeah,
they're going to be distracted by that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we just make sure they don't use cannabis from when they've gone to bed to that time where we tell them to use it, which will be around 11 a.m. in the morning, which again is not the time that everyone would use their prescription, but there's not really another way to do this. We can't customize the schedule to everyone's. So we I suppose get around that by just asking people, does this at all mirror how you might normally use cannabis? Would you normally drive after using your medical cannabis? And so we get some sense of how well I suppose the study schedule maps onto their typical patterns of use.
Yeah.
But really we're interested in not necessarily does everyone use it at 11 a.m. and if so, how does it affect their driving, but simply how is your driving affected by a single acute dose of your prescribed cannabinoid
within that first hour, like you'd expect. Yeah, and that's fair too. And I'm glad that you're not putting people on a cannabis fast before they turn up, just to make sure that they're free. So that's excellent to know that they're actually still living their normal life, and we're accepting the fact that as a long-term user they might have some THC metabolites still in their system. Well, I expect
everyone's going to have THC metabolites in the system.
Yeah, that's right. Well, mate, thanks so much for your time. Sorry about the little hiccup with the Zoom this morning. Who knows?
No, that's right.
It's a crazy animal. And if it's okay, we might catch up again along the way and just see how the study's going, and see if anything else has come out of your the other alcohol study you're doing for the ACT, and maybe a little bit more detail on how it's all coming out.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to catch up.
Great. Thanks for your time, Thomas, and keep up the good work, and hopefully it all goes smoothly, all the equipment stays intact and keeps working for you along the way.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, we'll be doing our best.
Okay, awesome, mate. Catch up to you next time. Maybe I'll see you at Nimbin in May if you got a little bit of time off from the study.
Quite possibly. Possibly.
Okay, mate.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Weed to
Thomas
know.
Arkell.
Weed
It sounds like a
to
very
know.
interesting
Cannabis
study. Okay?
info on a weed
Thanks
to
for joining
know
us on A Weed to Know. Catch you again soon. Bye. And once
Weed
again,
to know.
thanks for joining us on A Weed to Know. Presented by Andrew Fenwick, that's me. Music by Daniel Arvidson. And if you like what you hear, please share and subscribe. And of course, all three of you are probably going to at least enjoy it a little bit. But if you do like it, share it around. If you have any comments, put them in the comments box. If you have any questions or any information that you'd like to share, please get in touch. And once again, thanks for joining us.